think it's time to get started because we only have half an hour. By the way, I'd like to comment about the Dutch branding. Indeed, bol.com is quite known for our, I would say, visual style. So, hello everyone. Thanks for joining this talk. I hope the title got you excited, as we already heard in the beginning. But to kick things off, I'd actually like to start off with a question to all of you, which is, when is the last time that you saw a form like this and thought, exciting, I'm going to fill it out? Well, actually, not really like that. Many people actually like to fill out surveys. And I believe in this case, only 1 out of 35 users who we exposed to this form shared their feedback with us. So in this talk, I will share with you how we were able to derive a proxy for the user satisfaction for all our users, regardless of whether they clicked on the survey or actually clicked on the happy smiley or not. So my name is Roy, and I work for bol.com, as you perhaps already heard, which is an e-commerce company in the Netherlands. We also sell in Belgium. And well, here you see 2 images of how our web shop looks like. Perhaps a bit surprising, but actually we started out as one of the first online bookstores in Europe in 1999. And since then, we have branched out into many other product categories. I should say that's largely also due to the many external selling partners on our platform. So other companies selling on bol.com, with which we reach approximately 13 million customers on an annual basis. So this gives you a bit of a feel of what bol.com is. You can perhaps think of it as the Dutch Amazon, which may be much more familiar to some of you. So today, we're not going to talk as much about our customers, but more about our external selling partners, specifically on how they perceive the onboarding experience on our platform. So this is the high-level user journey that a new seller goes through the moment they'd like to sell on bol.com. So starting from account creation to, at one point, hopefully also fulfilling the first order. And each of these steps within the user journey can be broken down into more specific user flows. So you can think of them as micro interactions on our platform, which we internally refer to as the seller dashboard. So for example, to activate your account, you need to finish 5 tasks before that can be considered complete. And exactly those micro interactions that will be the scope of today's talk. So after you have created your account, the first step of the user journey, you end up on this page. And here you see the 5 steps that you also saw on the previous slide, as well as the survey component in the footer. So what we know from prior research, which I think is quite interesting, is that users will already indicate here in the onboarding flow that once they clicked on the unhappy smiley, are significantly less likely to eventually open the store, because not everyone who creates an account will also become an active seller. So this is a very valuable data point to us, because in many cases, those sellers ran into some kind of technical issue that prevented them from opening the store. The problem, as I mentioned in the introduction, is that we only have these records for a limited number of users. So how can we somehow derive a score for all those other sellers? Well, that's what we're going to look at. So to put it differently, we have the explicit user feedback for some of the users. And for all the other users, we know how they have navigated across our portals, because on the previous page, they were already signed in. So the pages that they visited, the elements that they clicked on. And now the idea that we came up with is, can we somehow combine this implicit feedback, their site navigation, to the explicit feedback? Can we identify patterns that are associated with good and bad user behaviors that give us some signal, and also perhaps that we can use to extrapolate our findings towards other sellers who did not share any explicit feedback at all? So that's quite a lot to take in. So that's why we added an illustrative example to hopefully make it a little bit more tangible to you. So let's have a look at our homepage again. And suppose there is a seller, and let's call her Emma, a really Dutch name. And as you may expect, Emma just created an account. She doesn't really know what to expect. So she comes here for the first time. And the first thing that she does is to click on start to start with the e-learning. Then a new window pops up, and this is what she sees. This module is going to take 15 to 20 minutes and contain some videos. Not really what she hoped for. She just wanted to get started. But okay, she sits through it, and roughly 20 minutes later, she returns to the homepage. But if you watch closely, the check mark is still gray. So she's afraid that the system did not register the completion of the e-learning correctly. And what do you do if a web page is not responding as you hope? Well, then you simply reload the page. That's also what Emma did. Unfortunately for her, the checkmark was still gray. So somewhat reluctantly, she starts the e-learning for the second time. And well, she has seen the material previously, so she skims through it, and 10 minutes later or so, again, she returns to the homepage. It's still a great check mark. So by now, Emma is totally pissed. So she spent more than half an hour on the e-learning and still not marked as complete. So that's why she decides to express her frustration by clicking on the unhappy smiley and leaving a negative comment about her e-learning experience. So this is something that happened in reality. And sadly for her, she closed the e-learning 2 times just a little bit too early. But there may be many more cases like Emma of users who do not share the feedback, of which we do not know what went wrong there. Can we somehow derive those users, or actually the paths that they followed as well? Well, consider this case, and if we visualize the user flow somewhat differently, then it may look like this. So she arrived at home, did the e-learning for the first time, didn't work out, tried it the second time, still didn't work, and then she responded negatively to the survey. In a tabular format, because this is also somewhat of a data conference, it may look like this. So we have a user who followed a user flow, and that led to an outcome. In this case, it was an unhappy response. And in a similar way, we can also construct the user flow for all other users like Peter or Olivia. And what you already see happening here is that there are lots and lots of different combinations of user flows, because very often in software, there's not really a predefined way to get somewhere. There can be multiple ways to achieve the same objective. And this poses a problem if we want to make a prediction, because how are we going to predict whether user flow is going to be happy or unhappy if we have never seen that specific flow before? Well, then you may suggest we can also look at patterns within the user flow. For example, all flows that contain at least the e-learning. So for example, compare the user flow from Emma with another one, which is very similar, like this one. It has exactly the same activities. So the home page appears 3 times, the e-learning appears 2 times, and then there's the unhappy response. The only thing that changed is the ordering of events. But as a result of that, the interpretation changed as well. Because in the top example, it's very likely that the e-learning has somehow contributed towards a negative experience. Whereas in the bottom example, that has probably nothing to do with it, because the response already occurred before they even started with the e-learning. So in other words, we need an analysis method that can not only deal with lots of variations to prevent overfitting, but also that is able to take into account the ordering of activities within a sequence, because that matters. And that's how we ended up at a technique called process mining. So process mining is an analysis method to extract insights from event log data. Event log data is usually data that's automatically generated from a system, IT system. It can be an ERP system, a CRM system, but in our case, it's simply web logs. In practice, you often see it being used in the field of operations research. So for example, to identify bottlenecks in logistics or manufacturing. That's also a bit where the name comes from. So it's sometimes seen as the bridge between data science and process science. But personally, I haven't really seen it being used a lot in UX research, where it provides, well, I do think it provides a lot of potential, especially in combination with survey research. It's not going to replace it, but it overcomes some of the limitations that we sometimes see with surveys. And let me tell you why. So no surprise, with the survey, we didn't get the response count that we initially hoped for. But perhaps even more interesting, we run the risk with a voluntary survey like ours that we only got responses from those users who have the strongest opinions, whereas other users may simply not be very likely to ever verbalize their opinion. So there may be a bias in the selection in itself. Second, and perhaps also as a solution to the first problem, we could make the survey more prominent, enlarge the size, or put it somewhere in a critical flow so that they are more likely to respond. And undoubtedly, that will lead to more responses. But we believe data collection, even for user around user experience should not come at the cost of actually the user experience itself. And lastly, surveys are and will always be a form of self-reported data. In our case, it's a partner who is going through an onboarding experience where they're also going to be evaluated. So that's why we also should look out for self-report bias, because they might give actually socially desirable answers here. If we now shift to process mining, then we can solve some of these problems. So no surprise, we have full coverage of all our data because we can look at the web logs. And as a result of that, there's also a non-intrusive way of data collection. We don't need any response from our users to get a final score. And lastly, since it's based on observational data, how they navigated across the pages, it's also much more objective. And that's why it can be thought of as higher external validity. So those are all reasons for using process mining, but I think an important one as well, because perhaps it looks all very complicated, is that's actually quite easy to get started with process mining, because you only need 3 pieces of information, which you can think of as the who, the what, and the when. So for example, Emma went to the homepage at 9:14, and then 1 minute later, she visited the e-learning. And these types of events are very common among, I would say, almost any web data event model. And even if you, for example, don't have the user ID, then you can swap it with, let's say, the session ID, and still it works out. So we know the advantages of process mining, and that you probably already have the data at hand to get started with it. What are the types of insights that we can use with this method that's not really very commonly being used in UX research? Well, we'll look at 3 perspectives: rework, control flow, and timing. Let me start with rework. So in the example that we discussed before with Emma, she did the e-learning 2 times. And in process mining speak, that's called rework. And there are 2 types of rework. We have self loops and we have repetitions. So self loops are activities that happen multiple times in a row. So you do the e-learning and then right after it a second time or a third time. Repetitions, on the other hand, as the name already suggests, repetition of events, but then there's some other event in between. And what we found is that unsatisfied users spend more time on rework, especially self loops. So those users who do the same thing multiple times in a row occur far more often among dissatisfied users. So in other words, going over the same page multiple times is highly disencouraging to users. And this gives them signal on how they perceive their experience. But it does not tell us anything about what's really triggering that experience, what caused them to click on the happy or the unhappy smiley. What was preceding that event? And that's what we can plot on a scale from activities that are associated with getting very unhappy to becoming very happy. Perhaps not really surprising, but one of the things that we found is that, for example, interacting with our chatbot Billy makes you much more likely to be unsatisfied at that point in time, or looking at the telephone number for our Dutch customer support, or seller support, I should say. On the other hand, if you successfully finish the e-learning, that's important to underline, or you fill out the verification code and that worked out as you hoped, are signals of being happy with your experience on a platform. But still, these are all, let's say, separate individual activities that tell us about their user experience. What we can also do is look at sequences of activities, how they are all combined together. So back to our earlier example of the homepage, there were the 5 steps that you needed to finish. What we expected, or what I expected up front, is that users will start at the top with the part of e-learning and work their way down from there. In practice, though, it was slightly different. Only in 1 out of 3 cases, they followed this exact trajectory. And in all other cases, there was another combination. For example, they skip the e-learning and start with, for example, the store details. And why this is interesting? Because we found that the order in which you do the activities often also gives information about how long it's going to take you. For example, the last row is for users who switched the order around. So users who started with the verification code, they probably had been waiting for that and then jumped right into it. Which brings me to the last topic around timing. And in process mining, there are 3 types of time dimensions: throughput time, processing time, and idle time. So throughput time in our case means the time from account creation to opening your store, or if you did not open your store yet, the last time that you signed in. Processing time is the time that you actually spend in our seller dashboard to configure things. And idle time is the time in between, for example, the time that you spend on waiting for a verification code to arrive. And now what we found is that the unsatisfied users take longer to open their store. And that's not surprising, because if you're going to repeat an event multiple times, then that adds up. And as a result of that, your total time spent on the onboarding will be longer. So these are all examples of rework, control flow, and timing. And what we did next is we used the input from the comments as a source of inspiration to construct additional features. So this is a comment, perhaps even Emma could have left it, that, well, let me read it out. Why do I need to finish one more step before I can open my store? I finished the e-learning multiple times already, but there's still no green check mark. Can we think of patterns that preceded this comment so that we also can classify other partners who went through a similar experience? Well, those are likely sellers who went through the e-learning multiple times. Perhaps there may even be some self-loops involved. That may be partners who spend quite a lot of time on the e-learning. And lastly, it may be extra frustrating if you already completed all your steps and this is really the last step that prevents you from opening your store. So this was one example, and we repeated that for all our comments. So all in all, this is how our process looked like. We started with the event log that I showed you. Then based on the event log, we derived a set of features using process mining, rework, control flow, and timing. On top of that, we added some feature engineering based on the comments that we gathered. And all of this combined led to a prediction for the user satisfaction. And using this approach, we were able to obtain the following results. So we could correctly classify 9 out of 10 happy user experiences and 8 out of 10 for the unhappy ones. So it's not perfect, but it's much higher than what we had anticipated up front, because this is only based on implicit data. User satisfaction is probably much more than simply clicking on a couple of elements, but it does show that it explains a lot of the variance. So now we evaluated the performance of this model on our survey sample. But ideally, we also used the model to make predictions about those users who did not respond to the survey, so the outer circle. So when we have the model, we can make the predictions, but the question is, how can we also evaluate whether the predictions are correct? Because we simply don't know. There may actually be systematic differences between those users who fill out the survey and those who do not. And we will never know. But what we can try to do is use our predictions in another model and see whether it adds any additional value. So we have our model that we built based on the users who fill out the survey, and we make predictions for all our users on how satisfied they are in the onboarding experience, and use that as an input variable for our open online store model. So we have one model with the input features that we already had in place prior to this whole process mining effort. And then we have a second model where we used exactly the same input features, but this time we also added the satisfaction prediction. And what we found is that the satisfaction prediction is not only positive and highly significant, but it also, the second model performs much better. This gives us some evidence that actually our results are valid. So we have these predictions, and now we're somewhat certain about the outcomes. What can we do with it? So if you have a look at the distribution of the predictions, then they are either very high for the happy partners, or they are low for the unhappy partners. And now what we are experimenting with is crafting personalized messages for users of who we think may benefit from some additional support, because we think they ran into some issue and this helps them get unstuck. So this is a concrete example of not only how a business can get value of process mining, but also how users can potentially benefit from it. So in summary, in UX research, we often conduct surveys. Actually, I've already seen many talks about surveys. But the problem is that not everyone fills them out, and there may be biases involved. We showed that using implicit and explicit data, we can actually make a model for the user satisfaction that turned out to be quite accurate, with which we then can make predictions about the user satisfaction for all those other sellers to know how they feel in the onboarding experience. So that's it. Of course, we had the talk title. I know how you feel without asking you. I must admit, I don't know how you currently feel, but I do hope you got something out of this talk. And if you have any questions, I think there are already a couple in the chat. I'll try my best to answer them.